Yeah, hi, my name is Sarnail Singh. I'm president-elect for CCIM Central Canada chapter and real estate agent with Home Life Maple Leaf Brokerage. I specialize in real estate activities in and around GTA. We have sold over 100 million worth of real estate. I would like to thank you for viewing this webinar. The topic of this webinar is the impact of COVID-19 on the commercial real estate activities in Ontario. As you all know, across the world, the outbreak is beginning to affect real estate decision-making on all asset class, including industrial, retail, multifamily, and so on. Though it's been like 1.5 months of lockdown, but I feel like 6 months or more. Just imagine how much impact it had on the businesses. The effect on business has a cascading impact on other people like supplier, like landlord, employees. Now, to discuss this and many other challenges facing real estate sector, we have invited barrister and solicitor Manraj Mann, who specialize in real estate closing, including hotels, retail, lease business, residential. So Manraj, welcome, and please introduce yourself, and then we can take it over to questions and answer session.
All right. Thank you, Sarnail, for having me. I think, well, I hope this is useful for everyone listening. A little bit of a background about me. Quick summary is I started off working with a estate litigation firm, and I have a background in estate litigation, estate administration, and estate planning. From there, I moved from the litigation side over to the corporate side, and I worked with a small boutique firm in Woodbridge for 2 years. What we focused on was healthcare law, corporate law, and that's where I began a small real estate practice. Eventually, I branched out on my own. Now it's been approximately 3 years, and what I do, what my business entails, is mostly dealing with small business clients. So what's happening now directly impacts my clients, and we are in constant communication and basically looking for ways to cope and hopefully get ahead of this, right? And yeah, so I think this is a great idea, and I'd be happy to answer your questions to the best of my ability.
Right, thanks, Manraj. So my first question to you is, recently the Canadian government announced a program for commercial rental assistance, and what is this and how does it work?
Okay, so this is a very recent program that the government's implementing. It's referred to as the CECRA, which stands for the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance. Okay, and the first question is, how does it work, right? Or more importantly, what is this? Basically, it's a financial aid provided by the government, whereby qualifying organizations can receive up to 75% of their rent costs to be covered. So what this means is these small businesses, typically, I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody's operating a Subway, okay? They have a lease that's anywhere between $6,000 to $8,000 a month. Let's just keep it simple and call it $5,000 a month. What this program would allow them to do, subject of course to many qualifications, is they would have up to 75% of it covered, right? It's a major help. It's a major help. The next question is how is this going to work? How is it to be implemented? Key here, and what I always stress, or what I've been stressing to my clients is, although this is for the for the tenant, it's optional for the landlord. So for it to work, you need the landlord to opt in. Okay, I think that's the first distinction that we have to make. It's not mandatory, It's optional for the landlord. Okay, well, let's work with an example. Okay, let's say you're a tenant. Okay, and your landlord has agreed to partake in this program. So for your purposes as the tenant, 75% of your rent for the 3 months being April, May, and June would be covered. Okay, now you have to realize that if one person's getting 75%, the other party here, the landlord, is getting 50%. So really what the landlord is doing is forgiving 25% of the rent. So it is it's a large undertaking for the
Right.
landlord. So effectively, the government is giving the landlord money to cover 50% of the income that they would have received from the rent.
Right.
All right. The other 25%, the landlord has to forgive.
All right.
Right.
Yeah. So I have one more question, which is if let's take a situation if my landlord and I have already agreed to a deferral agreement. Am
Right.
I bound by that agreement?
Okay. So and what we have to understand is this is something new, okay? And it's constantly changing, okay? So this process is evolving. So initially what happened was the government encouraged landlords to enter into deferral agreements with their tenants. And many of the tenants reluctantly entered into these agreements. The key point that I like to point out with deferrals, and I explain to my clients, is this: a deferral at the end of the day, it's not a break in rent. It's a temporary break. So what happens is that rent that you would have paid, you have to pay later on. And majority of these agreements have clauses which make a tenant pay, 110 or 115% of rent in the following months. A lot of these businesses are struggling to pay, the actual rent, the 100% rent. So these deferrals are problematic. Now, going back to your question, let's say there's a situation where the tenant and the landlord have agreed on a deferral agreement. Now, the government comes out with this program. It goes back to our initial conversation about the CECRA program. It's optional for the landlord. Now, I'm a landlord, right? And I've reached an agreement with my tenant, and my tenant has agreed to pay the full rent. However, obviously, in a delayed manner. What incentive do I have as a landlord to negate that contract and now enter into basically a rent forgiveness? Basically a 25% of rent that the landlord's losing out. So because it's not mandatory, it's not an inherent right of the tenant. So again, it comes back to a negotiation.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And
so sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, right. No, I understood that. So I also heard about CEBA, which is CEBA, and how can a businessman take advantage of it? Okay,
so what the CEBA stands for, like you said, was the Canada Emergency Business Account, right? And this is a loan for small businesses, right, that qualify. Now, what's the qualification that's required here is that you have to have a minimum of $20,000 for employee payroll. So you must have paid a minimum of $20,000 in 2019.
Okay.
If you paid a minimum of $20,000 in 2019, you may apply. Now, this loan you can apply through your financial institution. Okay, and it's based on the response that I've gotten from my clients. It moves pretty fast. You're looking at about 5 to 10 days. Now, the beauty of this loan effectively is $10,000 is forgivable, subject to you paying it back before the end of 2022. Okay. Right. Also, I should qualify that is the purpose of the loan and the use of the monies, the $40,000, must be used for business operating expenses. So you can't use the money for your personal, your personal investments that have nothing to do with your business. That would be a misuse of the funds.
Mm-hmm.
And in the event you do not pay back the 40,000 at the end of 2022,
Mm-hmm.
you are allowed to carry that forward, and you would be paying interest at the rate of 5% is the number that they have right now.
Okay, 5%, right. Now, I have another question, which is when entering into a commercial or residential purchase and sale agreement, what are some things which, as a businessman should consider amidst the COVID pandemic?
Okay, so let's work with your typical business transaction. In these commercial, in an offer, you'll have conditions which typically include franchise approval, landlord approval, right, or lease review, lease approval, and then financing. Okay, what I encourage purchasers to do is to inherently put it in a clause, like a COVID clause, right?
Okay.
In the event that someone is unable or restricted from satisfying conditions, which they can prove are a result of COVID, right? For example, if you had a financing condition, okay, and you were working on a transaction that was set to close April 30th, but because you have elderly, parents living with you, right, or you have young children, and you don't want to go outside and expose yourself to dangers at the end of the day, that is in and of itself a fair reason for you to possibly extend, right? So when we enter into these agreements, you need, and I strongly urge everyone to create a COVID clause, right, which will allow you to, in the event that you need more time, right, so long as you do have a reasonable link or explanation to the COVID pandemic, extend conditions, right?
Right. Now, what if someone has already entered into an agreement, but COVID has created an obstacle, which which is not foreseen, and now it affects the ability to complete the transaction. So, what's the exposure of the people in the contract?
Okay, so the answer to that question is twofold. I've had I've encountered this on a number of transactions now. In some agreements, you'll have what's referred to as a force majeure clause, which basically says that in the event there is an obstacle created as a result of something completely unforeseen, like an act of God, right? In this case, I would argue that COVID would qualify under that clause, right? In the event that that were to happen, I believe both parties should go back and negotiate and work around that, right?
Okay.
Now, at the same time, having said that, the seller, right, will say, hey, you waived all the conditions, I can't allow you to just walk out, right? It's a firm deal. But this goes back to your first point about having COVID clauses, right? So negotiating and entering into offers, right, now has to be a very well thought out process.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
I don't know if that really answered your question.
Yes. Yeah. No, I see. It's again new to everyone, and we just learn as we go on. My next question on the same line is, what's the typical cost to extend or amend a deal?
Okay, so I'll give you an example of what I encountered today. I had a client. It was a purchase deal, which was supposed to close Wednesday. We were unable to close on Wednesday because the financing did not come in time. So I had a call with the seller's lawyer, and we in all the what I like to stress also is now is not a time where you hold someone else's feet to the fire. Now is a time where we should act as a community and help each other. So the lawyer was, obviously willing to work with me. And what he said was, he says, look, Manraj, if you want to extend just a few days, that's fine. We can close on Friday. Okay, so it's a 2-day extension. And typically what happens before COVID, in the event an extension is required, the other side has to now amend documents or create new documents, right? Which obviously takes time. Okay, so in your standard real estate residential transaction, you're looking at what we say is there will be no further adjustments to utilities. So if the closing was supposed to happen on the 15th and now it's happening on the 18th, those 3 extra days are now the defaulting party's responsibility. Any interest, for example, I expected to pay off my mortgage on the 15th. Now I have to pay it off on the 18th because I need an extension. So for that extra 3 days, it should be the defaulting party's responsibility. Fair enough. And also legal costs. So the seller's lawyer will typically, because he has to create new documents and make certain amendments for his time, right? He'll charge legal fees. Okay, so those are your standard costs. Now, in my situation, from Wednesday to Friday, the lawyer worked with me, and what he said was he would waive his legal fees.
Okay.
My client really only carried costs for 2 days, which wasn't anything too steep, right? Which was fair. Yeah.
Now, going back to the pre-construction deals. Now, what if someone has signed a pre-construction deal, and what is the exposure? And if someone want to get out of it, or maybe builder back out, what is the situation in this situations?
Okay. Now, pre-construction deals, these can be a little bit tricky now because you've signed, and this is twofold. Now, let's say if I'm the buyer, okay, I signed an agreement of purchase and sale, and the builder gave me tentative dates, as they usually do. Okay, we expect to close on this day, or the first day is your occupancy date, October 1st. Okay, and then November 30th will be the closing date, the tentative closing date. If we need to go past the tentative closing date, then they implement new closing dates until eventually they have a firm closing date, and then site closing date. Okay, now what's happening now is both sides have agreed to these tentative dates, right? But now there's an outside force, right, which has completely halted construction. Okay, so like the government put a prohibition on construction. Now the builder can't do anything. The builder can't continue to build, right? There are exceptions, obviously, to the rule. I believe if you had started a project, you can continue it. But if you were planning to start a project, you would have to wait until the government says, okay, you're allowed to continue with the construction. The builder, that's his dilemma. Now, all the dates, everything is pushed. Now, as the buyer, right, I also have deposits that I have to pay. So now the argument is, why am I paying a deposit if you're not doing anything? Okay, so these are problems that we're seeing. But again, many of the builders are cooperating, right? And we just enter into deferrals, right, or delayed payments. And we can amend schedules and do slight amendments to agreements. So the content of the agreement is the same, right? However, we've made it, whereas, certain payments that were due in the first of a certain month have now been pushed to 2 months, allowing both sides to take a wait and see approach to see what happens with the government's rules.
Right. Yeah, because a lot of condo constructions and pre-construction commercial retail units all been coming up this year. So that's going to be a situation. So let's see how it goes.
Right.
Thanks for these points. But with your experience, is this a good time to actually get into leases, both from a landlord and tenant perspective? If you can share your perspective.
Okay. Right now, and I'll give you an example. Right now, we're working on a transaction where the business is basically, and the lease itself is being assigned. So somebody's purchasing a business and they're taking over the lease. Now, the lease itself is expiring in a couple of years. Okay. Now, typically, what the buyer will do is he'll say, look, you know what? Before I close this transaction, let me finalize the terms or extend the terms of the existing lease, right? So that way I know what I'm going to be paying, not only for the next couple of years, but for maybe a 5-year period beyond that, right? This was a standard approach, and we encourage this for purchasers especially, because the purchaser knows the state of the economy and they can ascribe what fair market value is or fair market value rent is for similar businesses. Now we're in a situation where there's uncertainty in the economy and which trajectory it's going to go on. So whereas people were paying a lot more for businesses, they may be paying less. And if they're paying less, naturally the lease payments may be less than what they are now, right? Depending on the state of the economy. So if I'm a landlord, what I would possibly say is, look, you're locked in for the next couple of years. Let's agree to negotiate in good faith at that time. Or if you believe that the economy may take a little bit of a, maybe a little bit of a downturn, maybe we lock into lease rates that are similar to what they are now in what was pre-COVID a flourishing economy, right? If I'm the tenant, I might say, you know what? No, let's just wait and see. Let's see where this goes in a couple of years.
Right. Now, with all this complication, do you think it's a right time to buy a business or sell a business?
Well, each business in and of itself is different. No two businesses are the same, right? You have to look at the circumstances and the type of business you're getting into. Right now might be a good time to buy for someone who's got the disposable income, right? Who may have more of a risk appetite, because what we're going to get now is a business that's most likely, slightly less value than what it was pre-COVID. So you might be getting it maybe 90 cents on the dollar, 80 cents on the dollar, right? But the risk that you run is, again, what's the economy or the business environment going to be in a year's time? Right? It may, who knows, right? It may just be that this was a hiccup and things continue to pick up, because every day we've seen it, how our population is growing with the immigration. There are many foreign buyers, right? So maybe businesses themselves will continue to thrive, and maybe there'll be a dip in residential, or maybe it'll be the other way around, right? It's kind of a wait and see approach. But if you have the disposable income, then maybe you take a chance. Same thing for a seller. He might think that, his business today, if it's worth, X amount, it might be X minus 10 in 6 months, right? Right.
Yeah. Right. I remember a paraphrase. It says that I did rather be pessimistic and wrong than be optimistic and wrong.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
With this, so with this, thank you very much, Manraj, and for sharing your thought, answering these questions. Now, for those who are listening or going to listen, if you have any questions, or you want to have a topic or questions which you want to discuss with Manraj, you can send me an email, which I'm going to put it down in the below, and then you can send me an email and we can answer your questions. And we'll have more such webinars arranged in the coming days. So till then, stay tuned, and thank you very much for your time, Manraj, and everyone. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.